Oceanigata, Jeff Ganohalidoh, Corntassel, Dagwadoa, Shalagi Yetli, Gwenasai. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Frontlines Are Everywhere, the podcast that looks at how our self-determining authority is expressed as Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and beyond. And I'm so pleased to have Melina Laboucan-Massimo here today as our guest. And Melina, welcome. Thank you for being on our podcast. I'm going to read a short bio. And so Miyowapan, or Melina, is Lubicon Cree from Northern Alberta, Canada. She's the founder and executive director of Sacred Earth and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Melina is an inaugural fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation, where her research focused on climate change, Indigenous knowledge, and renewable energy. She's also the host of a TV series called Power to the People, which profiles renewable energy in Indigenous nations and communities. Melina holds a master's degree in Indigenous Governance from 2016 at the University of Victoria with a focus on renewable energy. As part of her master's thesis, Melina implemented a 20.8 kilowatt solar project in her home community of Little Buffalo. And those solar panels power the health center at the heart of the tar sands. Melina also works on the issue of murder and missing Indigenous women and girls, especially after the suspicious death of her sister Bella, whose case still remains unsolved. Melina has studied, campaigned, and worked in Brazil, Australia, Mexico, Canada, and across Europe, focusing on resource extraction, climate change impacts, media literacy, and Indigenous rights and responsibilities. And in 2021, Melina was named one of the 26 climate champions in Canada by the Canada Climate Law Initiative. So welcome, Melina Laboucan, for being on the podcast. And would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Hi. Thanks. Thank you, Jeff. Tansegwakia, Nia Melina Miyowapan Laboucan-Massimo, Nia Nihiao Kinaskumptanawao. It's really nice to be here and have a conversation with you today. It's been a few years, but it's been nice to reconnect, especially after doing my master's thesis and having you as my supervisor, which is pretty cool. And you didn't,
I know.
I like how you didn't try to dissuade me from building a solar project as a part of my master's thesis. I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I was so impressed. Like the scope of that project has never been undertaken before or probably since. Like for a master's project to undertake the installation of those solar panels, and then I think you did a film as well as a write-up. Like it was just incredible. So I didn't try to dissuade you because there was no stopping you.
Well, I found it very supportive, and I'm happy I was able to do it through iGov because, it was just at the time there wasn't any other type of graduate studies program out there, and I was really looking for like years. Even I started my first initial master's at the York University in the Master's Environmental Studies in 2008. I think if you remember the first time I applied for iGov, and I'm just really happy I switched over to iGov to be able to make that type of implementation project. I felt the project over thesis, I mean, even though I did a thesis, but I think the project really brings real life examples to what our communities really need to see, as opposed to like like a book on the wall that maybe people might not read a master's
Absolutely.
thesis after the fact. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to work with you. So yeah, thank you for that. Well, the first question I usually ask of our guests, and it's really about Indigenous internationalism and what that might mean. So I think about how, as Indigenous nations across Turtle Island and beyond that globally, we have different protocols, we have different ways of engaging in treaty making with each other, with the plant nations, with the animal nations, with the land itself, and with the water. And so I was wondering if you could speak to maybe the ways that Indigenous internationalism maybe resonates with your work, or maybe it departs from some of your work.
Indigenous internationalism is something that I find inspiration in, because I've been able to travel to the Americas, and luckily because I was able to learn and be relatively fluent in Spanish and to a lesser extent Portuguese, but being able to communicate with other Indigenous for like this really long, beautiful, like, Abla Yala, um, Turtle Island, and that connection between the North and the South, and those prophecies between the condor and the eagle. So I feel like there is a lot of beauty, and I've been able to really meet other amazing Indigenous women from all over the Americas. I took a lot of inspiration of Indigenous resistance across the Americas and across the world, really globally. Um, because I wasn't, I come from a community where I was 7, right? In 1988, there was blockades. And so I come from a community that has resistance and really tried to protect our homelands and protect Mother Earth, because of the onslaught of logging, oil, gas, and now tar sands and fracking. But it was, so I come from kind of that inheritance. But I think as I grew older, and I feel like a lot of the resistance at that point in time was dampened. Like I just wasn't finding what my spirit needed. And so I studied, through my first degree, a lot of the resistance is around, America, like Latin America, and all the Indigenous resistance that took place, um, and also the horrible, impact of colonialism. And so I really found a lot of inspiration outside of not directly where I came from, but outside of the province known as Alberta.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I don't think there's anything more powerful than expressing that kinship and that solidarity across community.
Mhm,
So
and being in
kudos for that.
ceremony with one another, right? And I think
Yeah,
that's, for me, I've really been taught, when you start that relationship in ceremony, that relationship kind of extends for decades now, right? For me. And so it's like,
yeah,
even if I don't get to see people that I consider family, I know that like love and respect and solidarity is there if I need to pick up the phone and call them.
yeah. And the film you mentioned, was that Condor and the Eagle? Was that
Yeah.
the film? Yeah.
Yeah.
And about the prophecy, right, of
Mhm.
connection. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, what for that. Well, you mentioned that you were 7 when you first kind of became aware of some of the blockades and some of the activism in your community. Is that kind of when you started your journey to promote Indigenous climate action and justice and awareness?
I would say, I was so young and it was such a different time. We didn't have social media.
Yeah,
Indigenous representation wasn't a thing. You know what I mean? Like even when I started this work 25 years ago, it was like, why would you do that? Why, you have this education, you can go out and do other things. Not that I got that from my family, but it was also like from my peers and like high school or university, not really understanding all of a sudden like this like using the education and then using it towards, empowering our communities and working towards Indigenous rights and responsibilities. And so right away out of, I finished high school when I was 16, went right into university, utilized that education and finished at 21, and lived in Brazil and like did a lot of UN work to really trying to understand like the Indigenous internationalism, right? Of, went to the UN, got a lot of different UN kind of preparatory meetings in Switzerland and Geneva, kind of just really was trying to understand, at that time, the indigenous, UNDRIP didn't, it existed, but existed in draft, right? So I was learning about the draft of UNDRIP. In 2004, I went, to like another training in Australia around, UNDRIP and understanding, the draft of what was coming out, what was being pushed by our elders. And so it was like you really had to find those places and spaces. It wasn't, it wasn't at the touch of a finger, it wasn't a Google of a thing. Like it was, you had to really look for it. And so I was, honestly felt very lucky, and, a lot of prayers and like intention going into trying to find my way, to really dig deep into how we find justice and liberty and liberation for our communities. And so it was learning a lot of international frameworks and kind of that context, and then really trying to figure out how to bring it home. Um, so yes, I feel like within my somatic like bones, I definitely know that, age 7, there was that, the blockades and, but I was 7, right? There wasn't a lot of ways to actualize it at that point. It wasn't like my
Yeah.
mom could put a phone on my face in social media and it could become a social media phenomenon, like, no,
Right.
that just didn't exist. The fact that our community even had international press was like a thing, right? And
Yeah.
it people my parents' age that know Lubicon are like, oh, I know your family, you guys made the news in the 80s, like it was indigenous issues was not heard, it was erasure, it was like remain unseen, just like there wasn't a lot of uplifting our stories and our voices, like you see today. Just the reality was so different. It was shut the fuck up and get the fuck out, and it was just like
Yeah.
there was no care or concern often. And that's how I felt. I felt
Yeah.
a complete erasure and invisibility of my identity for most of my life growing up through the education system, right? Until I hit the University of Alberta and then found some little pieces, but even felt like there I had to really kind of yeah, people just didn't understand. I think at that point, like obviously the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't out. There wasn't volumes and volumes and documentation of the onslaught. So even when I was telling people at that age about my family's experience in residential schools, all my aunts and uncles went, all my dad went to as a residential day school survivor. And so people were like, what are you talking about? So it was just a different time of organizing, right? You really had to create those alliances and that connection through person, like for people, like going and like meeting people, going to people's communities and going into meetings, going to sharing circles, going to the UN, going to wherever to try to meet other indigenous peoples that had a similar politic and understanding of what does decolonization even look like. And that wasn't even a word then, right? And so it was just different. So I would say not until I got into probably my first degree I was able to really try to find some decolonial analysis, and because everything was so super neoliberal in at the U of A at that time. Right now it's a pretty amazing to see how there's a lot of indigenous peoples that occupy space and are teachers and educators there that just really didn't exist.
I think for the audience, it's probably hard for people to imagine a pre-social media landscape, but that was the reality.
It
And
was
I
just,
remember,
yeah.
I'm sure our paths crossed at some point in Geneva. I remember going there in the 90s, and you know, Satellite Cree Nation said that the UN, well, they accused Canada of genocide, and I remember the entire Canadian delegation walked out, and that was pre-TRC, and
Mm.
the chairperson scolded them and said there's no actual genocide that's occurring anywhere on the planet. And so it was just this eye-opening thing. And now we have that awareness, and not just among our nations, but beyond our nations, where people
Mhm.
would say that sort of thing. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I actually worked at a magazine called Redwire Native Media Arts, and that's how we met,
Ah,
Jeff.
yes,
When
that's it.
I was working at Redwire, Native Media Society was we would write and we'd have Indigenous artists and writers, and I was doing filmmaking then as well for some of the content, and would write it all out and design it all and then like print literal copies and then like hand stuff envelopes of thousands and thousands. We stay up till like 4 in the morning, like after a big run of like thousands and thousands of magazines that we would send across the country to communities, friendship centers, like whoever requested it subscribed, and even jails, like all over the country.
Yeah, and I kind of miss those publications. They're grassroots. They're still zines and things like that. But I remember Redwire was really at the forefront of a lot of the conversations.
It was an amazing experience to be a part of that, with other
Yeah,
indigenous young people that really cared about telling the truth of our communities.
absolutely. Well, you've spoken about, some of your community and some of the events that led to your activism. Who are some of the people that you have been influenced by over the course of time that have really helped you motivate your work? They could be people, they could be other species, they could be any number of things. The land itself.
I would say definitely my family, my kokum and Muslim, my grandparents in the horse and wagon with my family, and just going out in the summers and going into like the trap lines and where my family would take like the summer kind of route. And it was just horse and wagon trails. It wasn't, it was, so it was back in the territory, right in the 80s. The beauty of that, the lushness, the just the immense green, the peace, the calm, the fires at night, the stars, just being able to be from a small community, and that like beautiful quietness that existed. I would just look up at the sky and just like it was almost like you could hear the stars sparkle and twinkle. Like it was that quieting, especially with like the blanketing of snow back then. It was just like this pristine quiet that I feel like I'm always going after. And there's just so much loudness in this world now, so much like intensity that is kind of always being blasted at us, like an over, like a stimulation overwhelm. And I feel like the land is just this beautiful calmness that in her like state, in her like serene state, it just brings us so much peace, you know. And so for me it was really being grounded in that, those experiences, those like somatic experiences of in awe, like literally being a child in awe of how beautiful she was and how calming she was and how, you know. And I feel like that for me is something that propels me forward, that constantly drives me to protect her. And because of the beauty and the abundance that she's given us. And yeah, so I'd say that. And my grandparents, they were just beautiful people. They were very kind, they were very gentle, they were very loving, and they were very hard workers. They were, you know, sustenance based people. Like I grew up with my coco making, like she made all of the clothes for our family. And then that continued on as I became a child, like just having mucklucks and moccasins every year, all these really like handmade, beautiful, like hide smelling. She made hides up until her 70s. And for people that make hides, they know how hard making hides are. Um, and my Muslim too was a trapper and a hunter and had a hot dog team, you know, traveled on horse and wagon. And even my dad says his first car was a horse, right? That was just, they were land-based people. And so that was very much my experience coming into my family and community, of just being around very land-based ways of being, right? With medicines and moose meat and berries and just all of the beauty that was my experience as a child. And so I would say definitely from the land I take inspiration, and from my family in how they treat one another, how they treat each other. And even when people are like really intense, I think about my dad, people just like really intense hurling as a chief, and just intense hurling, like so much lateral violence and so much. And he just like keeps his head down and continues to like be so humble, and has like always given his best, you know. And like and just it's like such a beauty of people in my family, and like that love and humility. And it's always about community. And I would say just now, like just I love seeing the inspiration of all Indigenous peoples, as now, you know, what I wish I saw when in my like my teens and my 20s, where there was a little bit here and there of like filmmakers and people just trying so hard. And it's become more and more as those the people that I saw pushing forward and creating more space for more Indigenous peoples to now have like books and film and TV shows. And yeah, it's just amazing to see. So I'd say like I draw now a lot of inspiration on just being able to like have now my like books behind me and books downstairs, all like Indigenous writers, right? It like just wasn't, it was very few and far between when I was younger in my bookshelf. So I say I take lot of inspiration of people who are willing to create art and create um like share their knowledge, and through whatever medium it is, that take inspiration from that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember back in the day, it was kind of, you'd have to look for a Native Studies section. And it was usually this little tiny thing. It was all Vine Deloria Jr. and maybe a couple other folks.
Or just
And
like white people
yeah,
writing about
yeah,
Native people, right?
yes, anthropologists
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about.
And I still bought them because I was like, oh, I just need
Yeah,
something. Like I want to see what people are writing or coming across, So I have like
yeah,
this really weird collection of books from like for the past like 30 years. And now I'm really happy to see that like coming into books as well, of like the reminder of how we take care of ourselves and how we take care of the land and how we take care of each other are like so interwoven. I think for me, a lot of the self-care was like poo-pooed
yeah,
back in the day of like, you're an activist. You don't deserve to sleep. You don't deserve to rest. You have to be in solidarity. And you have this like whipping thing that I feel
yeah.
like is actually quite colonial.
Wellness was seen as almost self-indulgent,
Mhm.
20 years ago,
Oh
and
yeah.
kind of, we don't have the luxury of this time
No.
to do this. You need
How could you?
land,
How could
the
you?
land. Yeah, exactly. The land needs you now.
Yeah.
The community needs you now, and yeah, it leads to such burnout and such all sorts of things, right? Well, I'll kind of fast forward a little bit to 2015 where you founded Sacred Earth and you took on this amazing community governance project at iGov to install the solar project in your home community of Little Buffalo. And so this was, I think it was unprecedented, and I think it still is like the standard for like amazing community work. What led you to take this on? I know, this was a huge endeavor. I remember you had to do your own fundraising for this project because it cost a
a
certain
hundred
amount.
thousand.
Yeah, we had no money,
No,
of
that
course, at
I
the
didn't expect
university.
iGov to pony up, but yeah, no,
But you had to do your own fundraising
yeah.
to get this project going and then to install them and to implement them and to put that into a cohesive project. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges, but also some of maybe the triumphs of coming through that.
Let's see. The inspiration to build something tangible came from after a number of years already doing environmental campaign work and then seeing a massive oil spill in my community's homeland and my family texting me saying we can't breathe, our eyes are burning, and just getting really sick from an oil spill that was wafting in toxic fumes as the crow flies, probably about 7 kilometers in the bush. And the community school had to be shut down for 2 weeks. And I just remember my auntie saying, like, come home, like, we need your help. Nobody's telling us what's happening. And is it like, they didn't know. They thought it was like a propane leak in the school, but it was outside and it was just so overwhelming, the fumes, that they knew something had gone wrong. And the only thing I could find at the time, I started doing a Google search, and the only thing I could find was actually a business website that had said a pipeline had burst and the pipeline had been shut down. And this was just for um, money, the stopping the flow of money through a pipeline. And so or I mean profit for that for that company, right? Let's just put it that way. It's not profit for the people. And so that got me home really quick, and I started trying to find out what was happening. And there was a community, um, like the government at the time, they had called like for a meeting for the community to say, oh, we can tell you what's happening. And all they did was they made the community wait there, and then they just sent a one page fact sheet to the community and said, FYI, you're beside the biggest oil spill and the biggest spill in Alberta and Canada's history at the time, right? Well, we had find that out when we kind of made the calculations. And so I was like, right, pissed, because I was like, this is how you treat my family. They can't even breathe. The community school shut down, and yet you don't even have the audacity to show up as a company and or as a government that's allowed these leases onto our homelands, to even indicate to the community that should they be there, should pregnant women, should small children, should elders or people with immunocompromised situations be there breathing that in, right? Especially with like pulmonary lung disease, say, for instance. And nothing, just let people kind of deal with it, breathe through it, be exposed, right? And that for me at that point, we sent out like at that point sent out a notification to the wire and let people let the international and like national press know. This is the biggest oil spill in Alberta and Canada's history at this time, and yet this is how the communities be treated. And so my phone didn't stop ringing for probably about like 2 to 3 weeks at that point, and I was just fielding calls, kind of trying to fly over, get aerial shots, and I was just like, this is wild. Like, I just feel like it doesn't matter how much I'd already done international kind of campaign work to try to bring awareness around industrial extractivism and tar sands impacts for years, in divestment in Europe, or, you know, eventually testified in US Congress, just to stop the kind of impact, the amount of intensity that communities were burdening the impact. And it just felt like it doesn't matter, and I can speak until I'm blue in the face, and yet my family still can't breathe. And so that is actually that was actually the inspiration to build a solar project. Because I was just like, I can say no, no, no until I'm blue in the face. And yes, we can get things to slow down. Yes, we can get things to stop. Yes, we can get divestment. That all that work is important, and still continues to be as we face the climate crisis. But what are we building now? How are we envisioning a future that we want to see? And that was kind of the impetus to go back to finish my master's thesis, because I had started at York University and researching tar sands impacts. And my mom at the time got cancer for the first time, as a psychologist that went in and out of communities that were impacted by the tar sands for a decade, every other week, flying through the tar sands. And so I came home and I started, trying to abate that climate crisis and abate the impacts. But yet it wasn't enough. And so it was actually building this. And I was trying to find a program to be able to support that as like a, yeah, and I wanted to go in back to finish my master's, and I was like, "Oh yeah, iGov does project-based theses. I want to build this project. I want to build something that will actually be tangible, as opposed to, working with my community or any other community and not really having that tangible result." And so that was kind of the hope for this project. And the project, I remember applying for it through the iGov and just like putting it in writing, and was so happy to get in. And then started, eventually, when we finished all the coursework at iGov, then I was just like, okay, now is the time to really implement. So there was a lot of fundraising to be done, because at that time, solar panels and solar equipment and like the capital that you needed for it just wasn't there. There wasn't funding. And at that time, I didn't want to take government funding. I didn't think that that was the route that I wanted. So I actually went through the route of philanthropy. And even Jane Fonda I did an event with her, and she ended up donating like $10,000. And I found other great organizations, foundations, and a solar company, the Bullfrog Power at the time, actually donated. And so was just able to kind of bring funds together. And then, of course, we had the communication with with my community, went into the community and said, is this something that people want? Is this something people are interested? This type of technology doesn't exist this far north right now in Alberta. And so people really wanted it on their houses. They're like, I want it on my house, I want a house. And I was like, but then we have to pick and choose whose house we would put it on. And then I'm not getting involved in that. Like, so we decided the community was content to put it in, to build it towards the health center. And the health center was just like newer building at the time, and it had a connection point to connect to grid. So that's where we ended up building the system around, to be able to get it that way. And we did a top of pole mount system because we wanted it right in the community so people could see it, and young people could see it, so they would go to school every day. It's right beside the community school, so they can see it every day, and they see that in a place that is completely dependent on oil and gas, and a lot of people and families and workers are dependent on oil and gas jobs, that they would see a solar panel project that was producing energy in the community for the community. It was called Pitapan because it means new dawn, new era. a new time of deciding how we want to produce energy and find energy sovereignty within our nations, that it should come from the community, it should come from a member, it should come from a leader, it should come from a champion within their own community. And those are the most successful projects that I've seen across the country after filming Power to the People, you know. So I built a project in my community, and we had a ribbon cutting ceremony, we had a solar feast. After that, I connected with a production company, and they were like, would you want to host something like this across the country where you could go into other communities and see what other projects they've built in terms of renewable energy, eco housing, food security, food sovereignty initiatives? And I was like, yeah, that would be amazing to see what other communities are doing. And that's what we did for Power to the People. And it's just, I think the thing that we know constantly about media is that a lot of these issues are never uplifted, right? We don't see them in the news. We don't see them obviously even sometimes on social media because of algorithms. And so we really wanted to produce these inspirational, ideally stories to bring people to kind of hopefully be inspired that they could build their own projects and make their own communities climate resilient in the face of a climate crisis.
Yeah, wonderful. And so impactful, I imagine, in so many communities just to hear about this project. And I think at the time you focused on youth as to train the youth to keep up the solar panels.
So we trained young people and also community members that had the skill set. So it was like young people all the way up to probably age 60. So we had all different types of skill sets from the community. Anyone that wanted to be involved to build. It was really cool to be able to utilize Julio, he was like, I've always wanted to work on a renewable energy project. I've only been able to get jobs in the oil and gas sector in Alberta, right? And all the way to young people from the age of 18, 19 in our community to learn how to build. And then all the way from people that were very skilled within our community that had the skill set in construction and labor and building projects, to be able to utilize their expertise and then to build something that was from the community ground up. It was all by community hands that we were able to, in community equipment and community support. Now with Sacred Earth and all the lessons and learnings that we've had of building projects across the country, is that we not only need to build for capital costs and for solar equipment and or the equipment that we need to do food sovereignty projects, it's also the training and the implementation and the maintenance and operation that oftentimes even solar companies, which we're not, we're an organization that's Indigenous led and it's a nonprofit organization. So we don't make profit when we build projects in communities. But we fundraise to be able to educate and train community members ahead of time and then also maintain and operate after. But that was a big lesson because when I was a grad student and it was just the beginning of the envisioning of Sacred Earth as an organization, I was learning all of this as a trial and error, right? There was no guide. There was no guide for me to be like, this is how you build a project in community. This is what you do next. This is what you need to think about in the future. So it's been a decade now of being like, okay, this is what we need to do better. This is what we need to make sure that we have funds for. So we actually have 4 pathways now at Sacred Earth, as opposed to just the building of projects. We have, yes, of course, the implementation, the tangible climate solutions that we have in communities, but it's then paired with capacity and education. And we're building curriculum based off of the Just Transition Guide that we released a couple of years ago. And then it's also policy and advocacy, because if the policy and framework doesn't exist for communities to connect to grid and or off grid, then it's really, it limits the ability to do those builds. And then also healing justice, which is, I feel like healing was really not prioritized in a lot of the organizations, non-Indigenous organizations that I worked for in the past, and worked with. And, often found myself burned out or many other people burnt out. And I don't want to, run an organization that is burning out other Indigenous young people, because that was basically my experience of being burnt out and being used as, extracted labor, and maybe if it wasn't intentional, that's fine, but it had an impact, right? Regardless. And so it's really about healing justice initiatives within our organization, with the communities that we work with, and then um, yeah, ensuring that healing justice can be as a tenant of solarizing healing lodges, which we've done, and also solarizing longhouses to ensure that there's governance and healing being able to support within communities. So these are our 4 pathways now, from learning about how, like, what we could do better next time.
Yeah, amazing and amazing work that you're doing. And you're right, there was no blueprint for this work. It was something that you had to do, and this was your initiative. But it was also, I love how you talk about how this was a community initiative as well, and the community was involved in every step of the way.
Yeah, I was very happy that my community was on board and that people were willing to help me build it, and to find the money to build it, because it just yeah, the funding at that time didn't exist. It was somebody in the solar industry was said to me, I don't know, a number of years ago, they're like, your solar project got the most press, international press and national press and local press I've ever seen a solar project get. And I was like, I think it's because it was a bit special. It wasn't just like a company came in and took the money from a community. It was like a community built project to want to see climate action and climate solutions on the ground. That wasn't about money, it was about community energy sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, yeah, it was so innovative. So Wado for talking about that. Um,
Mhm.
so in 2023, Indigenous Climate Action, along with David Suzuki Foundation, Sacred Earth, and Power to the People, uh, teamed up to produce the Just Transition Guide, Indigenous-led pathways towards equitable climate solutions and resiliency in the climate crisis. And since you mentioned it, what are some, and these are things that Sacred Earth is doing, but what are some aspects of just transition that maybe we've missed in the past, or things that we should be more in tune with for the future?
Yeah, the
The just
just.
transition. I shouldn't say transition.
Well, like people
How-
like to call it the energy transition, and for a reason, right? Because it doesn't include
Yeah,
justice as a core tenet.
yeah, yeah. And it seems like justice is often discarded in these conversations.
I think as we know, environmentalism, climate justice movements, the terminology is often co-opted by the mainstream. And so when we see, we talk about energy and transition, oftentimes the word just transition is removed. And just transition has been a term that's been coined and utilized for workers and Indigenous peoples and BIPOC communities since the 90s, right? And so it came out of like the Blue Green Alliance, as they would say, from back in the day. And it was definitely about ensuring that workers were transitioned in an energy transition from, the fossil fuel era to, say, a renewable energy era or a climate solutions era, ideally. But we also, as Indigenous peoples, and as kind of like the lead author in that, was like, we also need to make sure that we have justice as a core tenet, but also Indigenous peoples and BIPOC communities included in the transition. Oftentimes in an energy transition, what we're seeing is the early adopters are people that can afford it, that have accessibility, and it's oftentimes not communities that can afford it or have accessibility or have the capacity or have sometimes even the priority, because they're a community of crises, and oftentimes our communities are dealing with multiple crises on multiple fronts. And so the climate crisis has been, now that it's on our doorsteps, people are prioritizing it, but it wasn't prioritized for a long time, across the board, for multiple reasons. Some of it for companies and corporations and sometimes governments, it was because of choosing profit over people. For communities, it was oftentimes because that wasn't the priority, because they had so many other issues to deal with, like, say, our community get running water, like that's a basic human right and a priority, right? So um, just transition is definitely trying to ensure that communities are prioritized and have accessibility, but also aren't burdening the brunt of, again, an energy transition, where if we look at critical minerals, or we look at what's happening in the Congo, or we see communities potentially being targeted, I would say, with critical mineral extraction. We really need to talk about what a transition looks like. And if we're perpetuating the same systems of harm that we've seen from the fossil fuel era onto an energy transition, then we're not really in a just transition. And so that was the point of having that discussion within the just transition guide, of having these discussions of really understanding kind of co-optation, um, carbon reductionism, environmental racism that continues right into an energy transition. So it's giving the critical analysis back to an energy transition. And so after doing energy transition work for over a decade, this, for me, I really wanted to see that guide out there that I as a young person didn't have access to. And so I was like, okay, all of these lessons and learnings, and how can I team up with other people that care about these issues. And so I was able to work with engineers and other amazing authors and around policy and around technology implementation. So we have 7 chapters that talks about kind of the justice framing in the first chapter, and then kind of throughout, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What type of technology are we talking about? How we don't consider mega dams or nuclear clean, whereas I would say other renewable energy industries might. So I think there's a discussion to be had. And actually, Sacred Earth is in right now, we're currently working on a critical minerals chapter. So we'll release that in the new year, because it was something that we talked about through multiple times throughout the guide, but didn't have a chapter for that, because our focus was on the implementation. This is, chapter 3 is my master's thesis, and talked about like the case study of Little Buffalo and how we implemented, and then kind of what were the key learnings of how you can start implementing. We have a policy chapter, and yeah, so we really want to give people, if people want to try to transition and find tangible solutions, there's at least they can refer to this as hopefully something helpful that they can refer to, and then also watch Power to the People if they want to take inspiration from other communities that have implemented.
Absolutely. Yeah, what for that. And we'll put up some websites and things like that during our podcast so that other folks can access these important materials. We often talk about how what happens to the land and water also happens to Indigenous people's bodies. And so that violence that occurs on the land, the extractivism, also occurs to our bodies, especially women, girls, Two-Spirit, and queer people. And so you had a tragedy in your family in 2013 when your sister Bella, who was 25 at the time, fell 31 stories to her death in a downtown Toronto condo building. And she had come there to study fashion design. The Toronto police said that they did not have enough evidence to prove whether or not the case is a homicide. There are no more leads to pursue, so they're calling it a suspicious death, but the investigation remains open. And I know this is a really sore point, so I just wanted to ask you, this led to you launching or helping to launch a database on murdered or missing Indigenous women and girls in 2014. I think it's called It Begins With Us. And so it was a really community-led database where families could contribute to this. And so I was wondering, you know, first, what changes you've seen in this conversation. This remains a crisis, and how this database or how some of these initiatives have helped you and your family get through this tragic event.
To be honest, I haven't seen enough change on the ground with families as a family
Yeah,
member. We live these daily experiences, and as an unsolved case for my sister, it's like an open wound, right? It's
yeah,
it's an unsolved death, so you don't have a lot of resolution around it, and that makes it very challenging to heal from, but also like feel any closure around. Um, so I would say it starts with us. That's definitely a No More Silence. Props to No More Silence as an organization, which is Indigenous and Two-Spirit organization, and they function out of Toronto. And that was, where I was able to have connections with where Bella had passed, organizations that supported the case for Bella to try to find justice for Bella. So No More Silence was definitely one of them. Um, through Audrey Huntley, who's an amazing Anishinaabe organizer and longtime organizer, and worked also with the Aboriginal Legal Society out of Toronto, who was able to provide legal advice for the case for Bella. The media was oftentimes not from our communities, and so they were sensationalizing things. They were making a lot of the stories of the women seem like they were quote unquote high risk and just doing really things to families in how they represented the families. And they try to do the same thing with Bella. And I'm just like, she was a college graduate and 3 months, out of college, and they would still try to portray her as X, Y, and Z. And so did the police, right? And so, of course, it's always connected to underlying racism. And so, a part of the No More Silence and the It Starts With Us website and database was to retell the stories of from the communities, from the families, from who actually knew these beautiful people. I think the biggest part of being a part of the No More Silence, It Starts With Us database was to retell the story of Bella, because what I was noticing and seeing in the media after speaking with the media for years, oftentimes it was just a poor representation of who Bella was as a person. Um, I I see the good thing about the representation. The change that I do see is representation from the families, but I really think oftentimes the stories should, if they can, come from the families, right? The ones that are living the day in, day out experience of losing and fighting for justice. I oftentimes do the work behind closed doors. I don't put it on social media. It's not for public consumption. It's not a performative act. And so for me, oftentimes that trauma is unseen, right? Because I don't know. I also have like a bit of private, like I like my own privacy, and I want to privately grieve for my family members. I don't want it to be a public consumption. And oftentimes when you're advocating as a family member, it can become public. And I did a lot of PowerPoint presentations for many conferences and universities and organizations, um, to bring awareness to my sister's case and bring awareness to the issue of violence against the land is violence against Indigenous people's bodies. But that has an impact oftentimes because you're not able to. The grief for my sister was very public for many years, and there came a point where I was like, this actually, I need my own healing. I need to have privacy in this grief. And a lot of times the media was relentless, right? And I said yes repeatedly because I wanted justice for my sister. I did it for that purpose. And yeah, so I see some change, but I hate to say it, but I don't see enough, obviously. And so I feel like there's not enough change. I feel like I'm reliving the past, right? And I do this for justice for our families, but it's really hard work because there's a lot of trauma connected to it. And the same thing, like the inquiry, I'm really happy that it finally happened. I know there was a lot of different opinions about the inquiry. Our family testified. It was closed door. Again, we didn't want it to be public, because this is often private family matter, but it's a public issue, right? It's a collective issue. But I feel like there's a lot of reflections I have right now, 12 years after my sister's death, of how public it was for me and how that really impacted my ability, my private, my ability to heal. So it's, yeah, it's just, it's still a constant daily lived reality, as like anniversaries, birthdays pass by, and there's no justice, right? And now we're fighting for justice for another family member. And I feel like multiple families have that experience. And and I would say the thing that I would hope to see change the most is more support for the families while they're going through this. And I don't see enough of that.
Yeah. 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 Widow, for talking about this. I know this is a really tough topic to address, and um, you know, um, really sorry for the losses that you've experienced. And thinking about, even since the 2019 calls for justice, issued by the National Inquiry, how little has changed, and how things seem almost worse in some ways. And
Yeah,
this
and
is a real crisis.
it is a real crisis. And I think the reason why was the government's refusal to really do deep down dives. And that's what our family recommended to the commissioners, was that the government, it was upon the government to to really see how the police, RCMP, Toronto Police Service, all the different policing entities that exist across the country, whether it be municipal or provincial or federal, depending on where you're from and what community you live in, you have a different, obviously a different policing entity, but all of them are have that innate racism, right? Especially the RCMP, they're the ones that stole the children from the families, our families, for residential schools. They have a really horrid history, and so this type of mentality perpetuates on, and like it's wild, that there's not enough cultural sensitivity, quote unquote, training for these policing systems, as they engage and deal with Indigenous communities and families. It just feels like the level of ignorance is still there, and it really sucks because it doesn't get us closer to justice for our families.
Yeah. 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 So powerfully said. And yeah, it's almost like willful ignorance.
And so just stuff like that, where it's just what families constantly have to experience behind closed doors, because not every single horrible experience is going to be a news media release. Is just, it's devastating, right? To engage with these entities that are supposed to find us justice, but we know are not finding justice for our family members.
Yeah. And then the impetus is on us, as you mentioned, on our communities, on our families to do the work, because we can't trust oftentimes
Yeah,
RCMP to do this work. Yeah.
do the work when, say, somebody like myself or many other family members have full-time jobs.
Yeah.
And so we're doing it off the side of our decks on our weekends, in the evenings, dealing with this very heavy mental, kind of emotional tax training. Like I was doing this during iGov, right? Like I was doing a master's thesis, and I was literally going to iGov classes, and then on the phone with police, private investigator, lawyers, media. That was like my evenings and weekends, and my daily occurrence for years. And then, it's just asking for people to function, right? And there's no emotional support oftentimes. I
Yeah.
think most of the support after the inquiries dried up, right? There was support for family members, but it was a monetary value of like, you have $3,000 to use this towards your healing. And it was just like, I wasn't even expecting that for a testimony, to have like some weird monetary value connected to my testimony. It was more, I want justice for my sister.
Yeah.
I want
Yeah.
the police, I want the police services to be investigated into, and have oversight, and a third party review of what's happening, and why these cases are failing, and why these cases are being left cold and open, and listed as suspicious and never found justice. Why? So anyways, I'll stop there.
No, no, thank you for that. Um, Kind of shifting gears a little bit, but I think it's in the same line. Thinking about, how your work, especially with Sacred Earth, but with just all of the speaking engagements that you do, all the writing, all the, the multitude of ways that you impact other people's lives. How are you sharing your knowledge of climate action climate justice and land and water protection with future generations. And I think if you're even your own little one, right, that you've got, and just thinking about those future generations that are going to take up this work as well.
The question is, what do I have to share, or what do I want to share, or how do I?
Just how have you been sharing this knowledge? Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of it has been through public speaking, a lot of PowerPoints with kind of knowledge that I've been able to learn from other elders, from my own experience, from school, from all the, all the different learning opportunities that I've had. So a lot of it's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speaking events over the past like 15 years. But people have asked me to write books, but I feel like it's busy to write a book. So I feel like the Just Transition Guide was kind of my way of putting a book out into the world of here's something that I feel like is needed and helpful and I wish I could have used. And we've had thousands and thousands of downloads, so I know people do have the appetite for it and the need. So I would say what we're doing with the Just Transition Guide for maybe people that don't want to download it and don't have the want or capacity to read 180 pages of research for the past 10 years is actually developing curriculum. So I'm working with my team at Sacred Earth to develop curriculum over the past year plus, and we've been piloting it in communities across the country. I just came back a few weeks ago, piloting it in my own home community with kindergarten all the way to grade 12 with adults, and piloting it at other conferences, and we'll be doing on the ground trainings for communities to learn about just transition. But it's also really in the bigger context of what is the climate crisis, why does it exist, really giving ideally a critical analysis from an Indigenous lens about the climate crisis and what climate solutions are potentially available for communities. And also we'll be eventually putting it into a national cohort, so then people can learn about it in a cohort style, like an online learning setting, and then eventually making it a course as for an asynchronistic model. So trying to make different ways that people can learn and communicate on the ground with us in community. But as we know, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of communities across the country and around the world. So we want to make it available online as well, especially for people that can access it in community. And then so that's how we're really hoping to teach young people, because I feel like the reason why the climate crisis exists is because we don't have these types of critical analysis of the climate crisis within our education systems. It's talking about how we flip on a light, how we talk about circuitry, but that connection of like, where does it really come from, and what communities are impacted, and who's burdening the cost of a fossil fuel era. So we really try to teach this now from a young age.
So important and vital, really, to our future. So what up for that? Kind of nearing the end, so I just have two more questions for you. And this is a question kind of bringing together all the things that we've talked about so far, the past, present, and future, and thinking about, what does Indigenous liberation look like for you?
Indigenous liberation looks like for me of people being able to be on their homelands and living in community and healing themselves and healing the land, and how that is interconnected and reciprocal, and that living on their homelands undisturbed
Yes.
by external forces. That for me is what Indigenous liberation is, of having the ability to be food sovereign, energy sovereign, and also just people leaving us the fuck alone.
Yes.
So we can just be in
Yeah.
relationship with Mother Earth. I feel like it's not that complicated. There's a
Yeah.
lot of healing to be done for the land and for ourselves, but it's literally being land-based and being connected to where we come from, ideally, if we can.
Yeah.
It's not always possible, but I feel like even though I live in Amiskwaciy, Waskagan, being able to go home as much as I can is like that step towards being home, right? But then there's always housing issues. There's a lot of complexities around it, but I would say going home and being able to pick medicines with my family is like the best form of medicine that I can find, oftentimes in the chaoticness of this world.
Yes. Beautiful. And then, is there anything we didn't discuss that you'd like to talk about?
I would just say the biggest thing I would hope for young people to be able to actualize finding ways to become more autonomous and like off the phone. I feel
Yeah.
like where there's too much social media and there's this like kind of fixation and addiction to it. And I feel like we really need to figure out how to build into our communities and become more resilient in the face of the climate crisis. And I feel like we're just not there. We're really not there. And it's a sad thing that young people have to inherit this climate crisis.
Yeah.
Um, and our lifetimes are going to change drastically, and it's not going to be through being on the phone. Our survival is going to be through being in community on the land, whatever that looks like for you, and having a garden, figuring out ways to become more autonomous from the system. And it's trying to draw us in while we need to be out, and that I feel like that's the wild thing about the precipice that we're on with the climate crisis. I feel like that, we didn't necessarily talk about during this podcast, but that is a very real, the studies are showing that we're going to be living very different lives in the next 25 years, and we're not ready.
Yeah.
We're not ready. I mean, I'm not ready. All of us are not ready a lot of times, unless you're like a prepper. Like, and it's a really drastic change that we're going to see within our lifetimes.
Absolutely.
I've seen from climate scientists, and I hate to be like the person, but I've seen from climate scientists by like 2050, like it potentially, because of all of the collapses of ecosystems around the world, like of the 7 out of the 9 major systems in the world, including like our oceans and all of the storms and the droughts and the fires getting worse and worse because of the collapsing of ecosystems and the rise in GHG emissions in the atmosphere, that human population could drop from 8 billion people to 2 in 25 years. Like, that's just something that I don't think we can really wrap our heads around. And um, I feel like the people that are going to be most prepared are the Indigenous peoples living on their lands, knowing how to really harvest medicines and harvest and live off the land, right? The survival rate doesn't look good. That's a scary, freaking shocking, alarming thing that
Yeah.
I don't think people are wrapping their heads around, right? And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that wasn't the reality of where we're at because of climate inaction, but it's where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah. And people need to listen and take heed. I think there's a lot of diversion, like you said, away from this topic. And we need to actually have these hard conversations.
Mm-hmm. We really do. And that's kind of why I said yes to this podcast, because I feel like frontlines are everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
we need to build our own frontline
Yeah.
wherever we are.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for the conversation and the continued work.
Thanks for having me, and nice to see you.
Yes, good to see you too.